Well, that conversation could have gone better.
It could have, true, but ultimately it's good that it happened. That outburst may actually bring more good in the long run than you might expect, Captain.
Not sure I follow. You wanted him to get all angry?
No, of course not. But still, it was bound to happen sooner or later, and that way, at the very least, it happened away from public eyes. It would not improve His Highness' reputation to explode like that in front of his soldiers, or stars forbid, in front of Muzakan Council.
Well, I suppose that makes sense in a way. But still, are you really sure it won't cause any harm?
I don't think so. Arius is not a vile man, and no doubt he'll understand that his outburst today was nothing more but bottled emotions finally breaking free. And let me tell you, he had a lot of anger holed up inside. Ever since we fled Melgar, he was trying to approach his exile in the most stone-faced way possible, without showing any sadness or anger or bitterness. Even when Nishizawa's men sent him his sister's head, he simply responded that he's happy to be able to give at least part of his family a proper send-off to the stars. Hasn't shed a single tear, not even when the funeral pyre was blazing in front of him, but I've known him long enough to see when he's hiding something, and I knew that this whole affair will soon catch up to him. To be honest, for a long while I was afraid that this exile broke him, but that anger you saw today actually proves that he's still focused on things that matter, and I'm here to make sure he'll go forward instead of falling down the pit of despair.
Then he's lucky to have you with him, Mr. Storm, and you'd do well to keep an eye on him at all times. From what I've heard back home, Ishizawa is really trying hard to take Arius out. At this point, he doesn't even seem concerned about collateral damage, which is actually something I can't understand. He won. The kingdom is gone and the Republic is getting stronger with every passing day. So, with all respect to His Highness, I don't think Muzakan forces could ever actually pose a threat to them.
It's not our armies the Chancellor fears, but Arius himself, or rather who he is. And he is a legitimate heir, no matter what anyone says. On its own, that doesn't mean much, but it could be used by Southern's neighbors to raise an insurrection in Arius's name. That's what Ishizawa fears. He knows his new state is poised to become the strongest nation on the continent, and Emerald Council and Goblin Republics know it as well, and they may try to use Arius to bring Chancellor down a bit, if he grows too powerful. That is precisely why we must think carefully about our every step, because at this point his so-called friends may turn out to be even a greater threat to His Majesty than his enemies.
That doesn't sound like a very pleasant way to live, seeing potential enemies in every person around you. But then again, the prince clearly doesn't think like you do. After all, I heard he hired that necromancer woman despite your protests.
Ah yes, the mysterious Miss Pirene. She's certainly someone to keep an eye on, but I don't think she means Arius any harm, though she may hurt him by accident, considering her utter madness. But I'm sure she has some other agenda, and though I don't know what it is yet, I will find out. But enough about us, Captain. I want to hear how you got here.
I sailed, of course. I am a sea captain after all, so when I heard that Arius is still alive and here in Muzaka, I knew that I had to steal my own ship to get here. I waited for over a year and finally a chance appeared during one of our merchant patrols. Wasn't easy though. They kept a close watch on me after I said some things that were not really in line with official government opinions, so I had to look for a good opportunity. And then I was ordered to monitor one of the more distant trade routes, so no one in logistics questioned why I needed so many supplies for the journey. I took my provisions, signed all the forms, and then sailed straight here. Wasn't the end of problems though. Some of my men were not happy with my decision and I had to deal with a mutiny mere few days after leaving port. And then, just about a week away from Muzaka, we met some giant, violent octopus. Tasted good when we finally killed it, but it wrecked my ship something fierce. When I sailed into Muzakan port, I was pretty much commanding a heap of driftwood.
No need to worry about it, Captain. We fixed our harbour by now, so we'll get her fixed as well. Probably won't be cheap, but I'm sure both Arius and Governor Gerstein will approve. Having a galleon like Silent in our arsenal would certainly make us appear a lot more powerful.
No doubt, but as I mentioned, I said a bit too much when I was still back home. Got me branded as one of with questionable loyalties, so Admiralty took Silence away from me. I only have a small frigate to my name now, the Unicorn.
I see. Not greatest news, but we can work with it. At this point, any warship is valuable, and... Aha! Here comes the prince.
and he looks like he calmed down a bit. Gentlemen, I'm glad you're still here. I wanted to apologize for my words back there.
Water under the bridge, Your Highness. The sheer fact that you realize there's need for apology is apology enough. But enough about that. Captain Yarohin here just told me that Ishizawa's men took silence away from him.
But that was my favorite ship. I loved spending time on deck with Leisha when we were younger. Alright, no need to talk about it here. Let's get back to my tent. I'll open up some drinks and you, Captain, you can tell me the whole story. With the town of Sur Carys reintegrated into Muzakan territory, restoring order to northwestern side of the island was all but decided. A handful of elves who were especially bitter about their treatment by the Old Kingdom still held on to some smaller villages and towns in the wilds, but without supplies from their main settlement, they were simply unable to hold on against overwhelming colonial forces commanded by Prince Erigen. One by one, groups of elven warriors were surrounded and either surrendered on their own or, in rare cases, were wiped out to the last man, as a warning to never again question Arius's authority over this island. By the time summer of year 1138 was coming to an end, Sur Carys and its surrounding territories were firmly established as part of independent Muzakan colonial region, or just Muzaka for short, and the locals started to, slowly at first, accept their new reality. And while many of the elves grumbled, most vocal opposers of this new order were already silenced by Lord Governor's army. The rest, however, seemed to look into the future with something that could be taken for optimism. Before revolution brought down the kingdom, even Muzaka was considered a backwater, and most people back home had no idea other towns like Sur Carys even existed on the island. Now though, the intrepid settlers could finally hope that, with their new government much closer, their concerns will finally be heard, and maybe things will start getting better. So, when a company of Muzakan walkers finished repairing roads that connected the two towns, roughly by the time most of the rebel elven warriors were already eliminated, exchange between them started almost immediately, and soon enterprising merchants realized that it was bound to be a profitable one, as specific qualities of the Frostlands meant that a lot of goods could be found there that would not be able to be procured from anywhere else. And said goods, once transported back to Muzaka, could be sold to merchants from Old Continent or Empire to the north, merchants who, in recent months, started to arrive in steadily increasing numbers to see if this distant colony could be a place where one could make a fortune. What's more, after over a year of hard work in the bay, Muzakan port, utterly destroyed by a thunderstorm before Arius arrived, was finally fully fixed and restored to operational order. The city, placed high on a cliff overlooking the ocean, could finally reopen itself to maritime trade without the need for all incoming ships to dock along the shore far away from the city. It also meant that, finally, Muzaka had an opportunity to start producing and maintaining their own ships, something very much needed considering that it was now, technically speaking, an island nation. And one said ship, a frigate called Unicorn, was already in dry dock, being repaired after a long journey back from the continent. By continental standards, it was a mediocre ship at best. It was rather small, which gave it decent speed and maneuverability, but said small size meant that it was also not stable enough to be outfitted with cannons, and instead had to rely on 2 deck-mounted ballistas and a company of archers to deal with more distant enemies. Against anything up close, however, it could use its speed and simply ram any foe that would dare to approach, and even now Unicorn's horn was encrusted in blood of a kraken it rammed on the way from home. Needless to say though, a single frigate, especially one as badly damaged, was not exactly something to be proud of, but it most certainly was a start, and when Captain Yarohin left Colonial Army's camp, he received orders from the prince to take his ship, as soon as it was fixed, and simply explore along the shores of the island. for despite the fact that few royal cartographers tried to make maps of the place in past decades, their information turned out to be almost completely useless, and so if the unicorn could make a trip around the island, it would at least allow local map makers to pinpoint its size. And information like that could certainly prove valuable, because as Lord Governor's army marched on, it was being surprised at almost every step by something unexpected. For instance, despite being mostly inhabited by elves, one of the larger coastal villages north of Sur Carys turned out to be a mixed colony of orcs and goblins, who made their living by hunting in local forests and fishing in the cold sea. More importantly, though, it also housed a large, well-supplied tavern that served as a sort of rally point for the greenskins who lived in the old kingdom of Southern, or, to be more precise, greenskin outcasts, brigands, criminals, Luddites who fled goblin republics in the wake of rapid industrialization. All of them ended up here and now looked for an opportunity to do something with their lives. In the past, they no doubt formed one of the many roving bands that plagued these lands, but by the time Arius and his men arrived, their reputation ensured that both orcs and goblins at least pretended to be decent citizens, and even offered their services for a modest sum of gold, though no matter how modest it was, Muzaka coffers could not afford it. But the real surprise was located at the very northern edge of the island, a place that not even orc marauders dared to visit. It was an odd structure made out of black material and surrounded by a vortex of swirling energy. A low hum could be heard for kilometers around it, and as Arius and his personal retinues approached it to take a better look, they realized that the place was far weirder than it initially appeared. Observed from a distance and obscured by snow and magical energy, it looked relatively normal, ominous but real. But up close, it became a bit more outlandish. As Arius wrote in his memoirs, when I looked at it, it felt as if part of my eyeball suddenly stopped working. The material it's made of is so black that it reflects absolutely no light, and even turning away from it requires some effort. The structure itself is made out of something akin to metal, which is, for some reason, warm to the touch, despite freezing air around it. And finally, it appears as if this entire massive structure, which must be at least 200 meters tall, is made out of a single piece of this material. We found no windows, no entryways, not even a slightest dent or a hint of what it might be. Galatea said that it might be a natural formation, but I would not be so sure. Somehow, I feel that it is here for a reason, although stars only know what it might be. Regardless of that description though, after 2 days of trying and failing to enter the black structure, Colonial army finally decided to move on, for although they managed to secure another part of their island, their job was still far from over. For the Frostlands to the south were still teeming with dangers. A massive ice sculpture was spotted near the main road, and its presence signified that there may be more Frostlings in the area, for they were known to build statues like that back on the continent as well. All of the exact same woman, although who she is, or why is her figure so revered by those affected by Archmage's spell remains a mystery. But to complicate matters even more, Galatea claimed that she felt some very disturbing energy further down south, located in a small abandoned village that, upon closer examination, turned out to be completely swarmed by a bunch of carrion-eating birds. That in itself would be nothing special, but amongst these regular avian scavengers, Arius' scouts spotted other, massive vulture-like birds, almost as large as a horse, and as aggressive as a drunken elf. Whatever they were, they could pose a threat to caravans and settlers, and so Lord Governor decided to clear them out, although, to his surprise, Galatea demanded that he and his people must not enter the village itself, for their own safety. And although many soldiers still had issues with her presence, the prince decided to agree to her idea, for, as he argued, if something distressed even Galatea, then everyone around should be cautious as well. For although fighting a bunch of birds might have seemed like an easy task at first, as soon as Prince's men approached the abandoned village, they realized that their job will be a bit more complicated, as the beasts turn out to be far more intelligent than regular animals, and their attack was coordinated and unexpected. Instead of focusing on Galatea and her shamblers, who approached along the main road, the birds immediately veered off and rushed towards Arius' skirmisher line, descending upon confused archers and gunners before they had a chance to react. Even the prince found himself surrounded by a bunch of fiercely aggressive beaks, and only his glasses prevented him from losing an eye. But fortunately, regular carrion birds proved to be relatively easy to take down, for, despite their ferocity, they were still just small animals, easy to take down with a single arrow or swing of a mace, although, at the same time, actually landing a hit on them turned out to be surprisingly difficult, and the soldiers they focused on quickly found themselves exhausted and weakened, which greatly reduced their combat efficiency. But then, a second wave of the beasts arrived, and suddenly the situation became much more complicated, for while smaller bursts charged in, obscuring vision of Muzakan skirmishers, their larger friends used that opportunity to approach without being shot down, and descended upon a company of archers on the left flank, tearing their formation apart, and killing more than half of the soldiers there in matter of mere moments. What's more, their beaks dripped with such undescribable filth that those who survived this attack with only minor wounds were still out of the fight, as their injuries immediately started to fester. But still, while this single company suffered crippling losses, the rest of the line managed to slowly untangle themselves from the beasts, and either took down or scared off almost all of the smaller birds, allowing all of Prince's forces to rush in and help their comrades. And that's what they did. Gunners, archers and Arius himself spared not a single moment and moved in for the kill, drowning oversized vultures in such overwhelming firepower that they completely ripped the creatures apart. By then, Galatea reached the skirmish line as well and launched her own spells at the remaining smaller birds to finish them off, but, much to her dismay, these attacks proved to be less effective than she hoped for, as if the creatures were resistant to her magical powers. But nonetheless, between arrows, bullets, stones and spells, Muzakan force emerged victorious from the fights and, aside from that one decimated company, it did so in quite a decent shape. Still, it was an important lesson for everyone to never underestimate the sheer viciousness of local wildlife, especially when it's backed by some dark power. And dark power was certainly present in abundance in this village. As soon as the battle ended, Galatea urged everyone to back away from it as quickly as they could, while she herself ventured in to try and find the source of the problems and hopefully remove it. The prince and his men listened without hesitation, clearly distressed by odd dark aura that seemed to surround the place, and set up camp on the other side of the forest to take care of the wounded there. And to reward the survivors, for despite suffering heavy losses, Muzakan archers proved their skills so many times that they truly deserved their commander's recognition. And so, the survivors received an increased pay and promotions all around, and, just like the knights, were rewarded with their own bits of land, once they could retire to once their service was over. It was not a large reward by Arius' standards, but to Muzakan locals who enlisted to these companies, often just to escape poverty, such recognition was beyond exhilarating. Sadly, the mood was brought down a bit by Galatea, who returned back to the camp and reported that not even her skills were enough to deal with the source of problem in the village, and so, for the good of all, it would be best to simply cordon it off and prevent anyone from ever entering it. And then, when most of the army got back to their duties, she approached the prince and quietly told him that if he ever needed to quickly turn his men into undead ghouls, she knew a perfect place to do so in one go. Meanwhile, back in Muzaka, the city finally started to get back on its feet. With the port operational and first Colonial frigate patrolling the shores, maritime trade could finally take off on a full scale, especially since with reconquering of Sur Carys, the city had far more trading goods that it could sell locally. Soon, first merchant ships departed for distant lands back home, with hopes of bringing more wealth to the steadily growing city. And in fact, Muzaka was growing so much that Governor Gerstein decided to build a new set of granaries within the walls to stockpile food from the new farms that constantly emerged around the city, as the area outside the walls now became much safer. With every passing day, life in the new capital city became more and more bearable, and thanks to regular reports sent by Lord Governor, everyone living there knew that it was all thanks to Prince Arius Erigen's efforts that this island was finally becoming less of a nightmare to live in. Obviously, a lot of credit was given to the soldiers as well, but the reports, that were read by town criers at every larger square, were lately constructed in such a way that focused on the prince above all else. The man who arrived here as a broken exile was slowly disappearing from public consciousness, replaced by an intrepid hero who braved the wilds and brought civilization and order to this savage and backwards island. The savage and backwards island, however, fought back with all it had, and news about recent victories were soon overshadowed by a far more disturbing report. A new fort was constructed southwest of Muzaka to serve as protection for nearby villages. And, for most of the time, its crew performed its duty rather well, until one night when the forests nearby suddenly erupted with wailing, blood-curdling screams. A horde of skeletons emerged from among the trees and made their way towards the hastily constructed fortification, crashing into it and chopping the walls and the gate with their rusted weapons. The commander took one look at them and realized that his crew of 40 men, including cook, scribe and blacksmith, would stand no chance against this wave of bones, and so sounded the horn and ordered a full retreat through a secondary gate. Luckily for him, his reaction was quick enough that his horsemen had a chance to reach nearby mining villages and declare evacuation, but the fort itself was lost, and as the morning arrived, retreating garrisons spotted a column of smoke from where their outpost used to stand. Needless to say, the prince was not pleased about this. Not only did this attack hurt him economically, as the villages were now abandoned once again, an expensive fort was razed to the ground, but it also could create another wave of fear amongst the citizens, and once again lead them all back into safety of Muzaka walls, where they would just clog the streets and beg or steal as there was not enough jobs for everyone. What's more, it was a stain on his reputation of lawbringer, and so, despite the fact that his men hoped for at least a few weeks of break back in the capital, Lord Governor ordered his army to march south and find the undead horde responsible for this attack. Which proved to be surprisingly easy, as said horde continued its rampage north and was soon spotted by Colonial scouts. But to their surprise, it was not formed out just of skeletons as it initially appeared. In broad daylight, everyone could see around 200 hooded figures walking beside the bony warriors, and it quickly became obvious, due to staffs they were wielding, that these mysterious strangers were in all probabilities necromancers and leaders of this entire group. Why would they attack Muzakan settlers was a mystery, just as the necromancers themselves. For when the scouts got close enough that they could easily observe these robed men through spyglasses, they realized that they were, in fact, not men at all, but something else, something that no one has ever seen before. Most of their features were hidden beneath their robes, but it was clear as day to anyone who saw them that their posture was completely inhuman, not to mention that they all had tails, something that vast majority of humans, elves, goblins, orcs and even frostlings did not possess. A group of braver outriders got even closer to them and soon heard that these beings spoke in a tongue that no one could understand either, so whatever they were, their presence had to be treated with utmost care. It was easier said than done though, and soon some of the scouts were spotted, and the horde suddenly sprang to life, chasing after them on their shambling, tireless legs. The army was taken aback by this sudden charge, as the men were arrayed in several columns as they marched across the wilds, and so Galatea volunteered to ride on ahead to delay incoming corpses, while Colonial forces quickly armed themselves and formed a line on the plain behind her, using rock formations to protect their flanks. It took quite a while to get everyone organized, but Miss Pireni once again proved her abilities and, using her own undead warriors as bait, managed to delay incoming necromancers and their chargers long enough for Muzakan forces to present a line of spears, swords and shields to face their enemies. and just in time, for when Galatea rushed back to the main formation, the robed figures chasing her were right on her heels, already launching magical attacks at Muzaka's soldiers. Mr. Storm and Arius rode on ahead a bit and shouted at the necromancers, trying to get them to communicate, but were welcomed only by another barrage of magical bolts and some indescribable growling, which forced both men to fall back and prepare for battle, although not before Mr. Storm launched one of his own spells at one of the hooded groups, sending dozens of the creatures flying backwards to the sound of breaking bones. Such deadly display, however, meant little to surviving necromancers, who simply turned back, raised their staffs and performed an incantation that brought most of their fallen companions back, although in far worse shape than before. The other group, instead of simply charging forward as was expected, turned around and launched an attack at the knights who were preparing on the left flank. But the skeletons, fortunately, behaved as predictable as it was expected of them and simply charged on towards the nearest foe, which just so happened to be another set of corpses reanimated by Galatea. Corpses that, despite their usefulness, were nothing more but expendable meat shields. Still, despite the attack being far better coordinated than Colonial forces expected, the hooded mages and their skeleton warriors made one critical mistake. They were now all bunched up near Muzaka lines, close enough to be in range of the skirmishers and siege engines. And as the skeletons ran forward, they were suddenly pulverized by rocks dropped from the heavens that crushed these undead warriors into useless little pieces. From the middle of the line, Mr. Storm and his students launch another shockwave at the robed figures on the right flank, decimating them once again. Except this time, they received no chance to bring their fallen back up again, as Galatea and her own hooded horsemen charged on ahead and, together with her undead minions, rode down the necromancers with no mercy. And this was pretty much enough to completely turn the tables on the attackers. Emboldened by Arius' supporters, the rest of the army moved forward as well. Archers and gunners launched volley after volley at skeleton warriors, and although these attacks were not overly effective, as it was not an easy task to shoot someone made almost entirely just out of bones, they were nonetheless enough to weaken the skeletons enough for the Wolvenguard and the militiamen to finish them off. On the left, the second group of necromancers found themselves attacked by Muzaka swordsmen, and as soon as they turned around to face this threat, they were ridden down by the knights, who simply ran through their formation without even slowing down. By the time Arius and his own retinue reached the fight, only a handful of undead were still up, and a charge from the prince was enough to finish them off. The shambling horde that raised the southern fort was destroyed, but it was not a perfect victory, as their origins and motives behind their attack were still unknown. And, most importantly, no one could really tell who they were, and so, as soon as the fight was over, Arius ordered his men to bring as many of the hooded corpses back to the camp, hoping that Galatea could be able to learn something from them. Miss Pireni? Miss Pireni, are you there? Is it safe to enter now? I wanted to ask you about the results of your autopsies. You've been at it for almost 6 hours now.
Yes, you can come in, my prince. The autopsies are definitely over. Not that I have much to show for it.
I can see that. What happened here? Last time I heard you had an entire pile of corpses here.
Had, but right now that dust you can see on the floor is all that's left from them. Which, I admit, confirms some of my ideas, but it doesn't really help much.
Well, better to have some info than nothing. So, go ahead and tell me what you found.
Right, but grab that broom while you're there. We can talk and clean this mess at the same time. First, I don't think we needed any autopsy to figure out that these creatures, whatever they were in life, were ghouls when we met them, which means they were capable of intelligent thinking.
True enough, I saw that with my own eyes. While those shamblers you raised and those skeletons they sent at us were pretty much just mindless suicidal horde, these hooded ones were clearly trying to stay in one piece. But something doesn't make sense. When we first saw them, we suspected that they may be intelligent and tried to communicate with them, but there was no response, like they couldn't hear us.
Or maybe they couldn't understand us. The fact that they started to turn to dust almost instantly after the battle means that they have been ghouls for a very, very long time. So when we finally took them down, all that time they escaped caught up to them. So perhaps they were just remnants of some extremely old civilization that lived here before, maybe even a pre-awakening one. Not that it helps us to understand who they were, but together with the fact that they had tails, I think it's safe to say that they were not one of continental or imperial races.
Then who were they then? I have not heard anything about these islands having any native inhabitants.
Maybe they don't anymore, or maybe they were brought from somewhere else. It's honestly impossible to tell, especially now when all evidence turned to ash.
That's not great, I have to admit. How can I promise people of this colony safety when I don't even know who the creatures attacking them are? And I can't expect them to just go out there into the wilds if there's a chance that there may be more dangers outside. Stars damn it all, if such an attack happens again, we'll have another wave of panic on the frontier, and all settlers will just pack their things and go back to Muzaka, or even back to the continent now that the port is finally operational.
And would you try to stop them if they tried to go back? No, do not answer. I know why you're doing this. If you want to get your revenge, then you can't allow your people to just abandon you here and go to the Republic. Someone has to walk the fields, eh? But hey, there's no need to worry, my dear prince. Your beloved Galatea is here, and she may have an idea where these creatures came from, and how to stop them.
You do? Then why haven't you said anything sooner?
Because the idea came into my mind around 5 minutes ago. If I wasn't so distracted with your pretty face, I would...
Alright, that's enough. If you know something, tell me.
And there you go, being all serious and boring again. But fine, you remember when I told you my parents died almost immediately after we got here? Well, I was just a little girl back then and I had no idea what to do, so I just wandered around west of Muzaka where our old farm used to be. It's not that far away from here, truth be told, not that I'd want to visit. Still, I just walked, hoping to find another settlement, and out of nowhere I was approached by a bunch of people from the Republics on the road. They offered me food and told me they'll help me find my way, but, well, basically they just kidnapped me without me even understanding what happened. And these people were necromancers. Not friendly and pretty necromancers like yours truly, but old-fashioned ones. The kind that kidnapped people to turn them into undead servants or soldiers to capture even more victims. They traveled exclusively at night, so I failed to realize that instead of moving towards Muzaka, we were going in a completely opposite direction. We soon entered Ashlands, those big open hills to the west, and some days later we arrived in their camp. I don't remember much from it, but I think they wanted to use me to fuel some kind of ritual. They had this huge circle made out of bones and parts of dead bodies, which, as I now know, was used to amplify their spells. They could basically tell all dead bodies for kilometers around to dig themselves up and move to the circle.
Right, that would explain the skeletons, but not the ghouls. As you said, they're intelligent, so they shouldn't blindly obey commands of some hedge necromancers.
True, most modern ones would not, but as you may be aware, ghouls tend to degenerate over time if they don't take proper care of themselves. Maybe those ones we met were so old they actually couldn't resist the summons, but again, that would mean they must have been really, really old.
Very well then, but never mind that for now. Continue your story.
I don't actually like talking about it too much. As I said, I don't really remember what happened there, but I remember them talking about bringing back something from a place they called a lost city. Not sure what they meant by that though, but still I understand that they had problems getting into the place, said something about weird things protecting it. So they tried to resurrect, well, something. I don't know what, but it was clearly big. But it failed in the end. They threw me in the circle and started chanting something, and next thing I knew, a big creature made out of bones stood above me while I couldn't move, like someone took all my strength away. But the thing just looked at me and then charged at the necromancers. Couldn't see what happened there because I wasn't able to even turn my head, but when I finally regained my senses, the place was a graveyard. Most of my kidnappers were dead, some probably escaped, and whatever they have summoned was gone. I wanted to get out of there, but I was too weak, too confused and scared. And they had a pretty decent setup there, so I stayed for at least 5 years, I think. I read their books, emptied their larder, and then, when it finally ran out, I used knowledge found in these books to bring back my first skeleton, which I then sent hunting. Then I put together another one, and another until I had a retinue large enough to protect me on my way home, but by the time I got back my parents' farm was completely overgrown. So I went north and found refuge in some village on the road to Sur Carys. You would be surprised how quickly people learn to rely on necromancers and their skills. It went so crazy that I had to chase away boys from the village with my scythe, and then I finally got away and started selling my skills on the road. For I always knew my life would take me somewhere higher, to the very top of society, and then I heard the prince was around, so I knew what to do.
Indeed. Tell me though, could you lead us to that place? That circle sounds like a place we should investigate.
It was long ago, but give me a map and I can mark a general area where it should be, but is that really all you have to say? I told you my story and all you're thinking about is some ritual site that has been abandoned for years?
Yes, because from what you've told me, it may be the source of our problems. You said it yourself that some of the necromancers got away. Maybe they're finally back. And as for your story, well, yes, truly a tragic one. Would probably have a bit more of an effect if I believed even a single word of it, though. It's obviously trying to get me to that place on the western shore. I don't know why, and you clearly don't want to tell me the truth, but so far your little hints have been beneficial for us, so I'll trust you. For now.
Clever boy. Very well then, let's have it your way. Shall we get back to work then?
And so, with yet another clue about the island provided by the secretive necromancer, Arius and his army departed into the wilds once again, although as they did so, many of the soldiers shot quick, longing glances to the east towards Muzaka. The city wasn't anything spectacular to be sure, but after spending so many months marching up and down trackless hills and forests and fighting all manners of beasts and men, even a cliffside colonial capital had a certain appeal. But as long as the island was not secured, there was still a lot to do, and so the soldiers, especially locals who had a lot at stake here, gritted their teeth and marched on into scorched volcanic highland that dominated western part of the island. But as they approached it, something else caught their eyes, something that was perhaps even more remarkable than that black stone pillar in the north. For as the army approached the fiery highlands, it was welcomed by a sight of a massive plateau rising hundreds of meters above all surrounding terrain, an unusual geological formation to be sure. But on top of it, one could see something far more interesting. Ruins that, upon closer examination through a spyglass, appeared to be built in a style that was unheard of anywhere else. Round, domed buildings dominated most of the plateau, with even higher towers scattered between them, still standing strong despite their obvious old age. Mr. Storm, excited with such a discovery, immediately asked Arius to take a detour and investigate, since a place like that was never seen before, and the request was granted, although whether the prince was just as interested in the historical side of this place, or was simply curious if there was something useful or valuable there remains unclear. Regardless, a small expedition detached from the main army and ventured towards the plateau, eventually spotting a narrow, winding path that would take them into the ruined city. But in that very moment, Muzaka's luck ran out, for as Arius and a group of his closest followers approached the top, they were suddenly greeted by a combination of inhuman shrieks and hisses that made hair on everyone's heads rise up. Moments later, a figure slithered through the ruined gate, then another one, followed closely by several more. Larger than average human, these beings were like a cross between snakes and men, and though it took even well-read Mr. Storm a while to identify them, once he did so, he immediately told everyone to back off and get off the plateau as quickly as possible. For these creatures were Nagas, an ancient, mysterious race of amphibious beings that, through all recorded history, kept a healthy distance between themselves and any other nation. But those were not simple beasts. They were civilized and clearly capable of higher thinking, evidenced by ornate weapons and armor they carried, but at the same time, they were also fiercely territorial, and most historical reports that described them indicated that they only interact with other races through violence. What's more, they were one of the few races that actually managed to survive mass extermination of magical beings in recent centuries, as no one could tell where their civilization originated from. Some scholars claimed that there was no civilization, and that Nagas lived in simple, semi-nomadic tribes. Others claim that their cities are located at the bottom of the ocean, and that second hypothesis was usually the one most learned men agreed on, since vast majority of old Naga settlements were located on the shore, which made their presence here, in this city far away from the ocean and in the middle of volcanic heights, even more mysterious. But regardless of the reason, the Nagas were here anyway, and as soon as they spotted intruders walking towards their grounds, they slithered on to meet them, brandishing an impressive array of weapons. So impressive, in fact, that Arius agreed to Mr. Storm's suggestion without hesitation and ordered a full retreat, especially since the narrow path meant that even if the entire army was here, only a handful of soldiers could actually fight. Galatea tried to protest and even rode on ahead to try to communicate with the snake people, but a rain of thrown spears forced her to back off and flee back to the main formation, angry that she was not able to investigate the city that, apparently, her former captors were so obsessed with. But as she got back to the main group, she was welcomed back by Arius, who met her with a steel gaze. This, as he said, was another bunch of pests that infested his island and threatened his people. He backed off for now, but he would return, and if the Nagas would once again try to stand between him and this forgotten city, he would remove them by any means necessary. For now though, the army continued the march towards western shore of the island, venturing even deeper into fiery ashlands there. It was a bleak and deadly landscape, with rivers of molten lava breaking through the surface in some places, but even such scorching scenery was not enough to withstand the might of Archmage's incantation of frost. For further to the north, the ashlands suddenly ended as if someone cut them in half, replaced by snowy frostlands. It was an odd sight to be sure, two extremes, frost and flames in one place, both fighting for dominance in the area and filling the air around them with condensation as molten rocks met with ever-falling snow. But to Arius and his men, this spectacle was but a secondary issue, for as they moved deeper into burned-out area, they found the second place Galatea mentioned in her tale, a necromantic circle placed right in the middle of open field of ash and surrounded by shambling undead that seemingly guarded this place from unwelcomed visitors. But said visitors were more than ready to meet them, and Colonial force formed up, steeling itself for another fight, which, to their surprise, has not happened. Instead, Muzaka's own necromancer rode on ahead and approached the circle despite all of the corpses charging towards her. And as she got closer, Galatea raised her voice in a quick, sharp incantation which, mere seconds later, caused all of the shamblers in the area to fall apart, leaving nothing but dust in the wind. The soldiers cheered and, led by Mr. Storm, rushed into the circle in order to completely destroy it, but Galatea, without her usual smile, simply returned to her tent without saying a word, prompting the prince to check up on her. After all, they just scored an important victory that greatly improved security on the island, not to mention that Galatea herself found and destroyed the place that haunted her since childhood. But it was clear that to her, this story was far from over. Her captors were not there as she expected, and so many of her questions remained unanswered, although what these questions were, Prince Arius could not say. All that Galatea had now was that single lead, the city overtaken by Nagas, and so Lord Governor promised her to get to work on capturing it as soon as possible. Still though, the entire venture proved to be more than profitable. Not only a lot of valuables were found amongst the myriad of corpses scattered around the area, but the corpses themselves provided invaluable insights, as among them, Mr. Storm and his men found ones that looked similar to those hooded figures that led an attack on the southern fort, which meant that, in all probabilities, this very place was the source of this attack. And now it was destroyed, its power removed and cleansed as the circle was burned and buried by colonial forces. The necromancers still had to be found and eliminated to ensure that such an act of aggression won't happen again, but it was still an important victory, especially since it provided Muzaka forces with a clear goal they could now walk towards. For now though, the army used the fact that they were already on the western shores and continued their march towards the sea in order to fully secure the area. Fortunately for them, it proved to be far more peaceful, although not completely. And yet, despite this seeming peacefulness, it was still quite outlandish. For mere few days after clearing lair of the Necromancers, Colonial scouts reported yet another undead horde, this time located on a shore, hidden away in some ancient tomb. It was clearly a sign that more necromancers were still around, but at the same time the tomb itself proved to be advantageous to Muzakan forces. It could have been cleared out, of course, but it was built in such a way that only a fraction of the entire force could enter it at once, which would no doubt lead to heavy losses. So instead of throwing lives away, Arius simply gathered his engineers, emptied half of gunpowder reserves for his gunners, and blew up the entrance to the crypt, ensuring that nothing could come in or out. In time, the place would have to be cleared and explored, but for now such measure was enough, especially since there was more work to do, as there was far more immediate threat close by. Namely, it was a Frostling raiding party that made themselves a little landing zone on a small peninsula on the western edge of the island. As always, facing Frostlings was not a pleasant proposition, but at this point, Muzakan army was so large and so well equipped that icy warriors took one look at them and immediately scurried back to their longboats and fled. And they did so in such a hurry that they left almost all of their, stolen no doubt, valuables behind, turning the day into a very good one for Colonial forces. And then, few days later, another surprise turned up, in form of yet another goblin village where tired Muzakan army could finally rest up for a few days. And though the surroundings were certainly not pleasant to look at, with grey ocean, scorching ashlands and occasional blizzard blowing in from the north, the very prospect of having a few beers under a roof worked wonders for the morale. Which was for the best, for a few days later a messenger bird arrived from southeast with a message from Captain Yarohin, and it was not a pleasant one. To Lord Governor Arius Erigen, the message said. Per your orders, we have sailed along the shore of the island in order to confirm or correct the few maps Muzakan cartographers managed to provide for us. Our venture north proved mostly uneventful, but the southern one quickly became problematic, as we have confirmed reports of several scouts that claim that Frostlands have taken over the southern shore. That, however, was just the beginning of problems. Following instructions of your companion, we sailed towards the place where the settlement of Frimgear was supposed to be located. And it is there alright, but not as we expected, for we could spot even from the sea that it was overtaken by the Frostlings. Judging by the presence of one of their spires, their attack must have happened at least 2 or 3 years ago, and the fact that no one heard about it indicates that it was meticulously planned and well executed. The town itself is gone, and so are its inhabitants, although most of the infrastructure is still there. Fortunately, a scouting party I sent ashore confirmed that right now the town itself is mostly undefended, so if you wish to recapture it for Muzaka, now would be a perfect time to do so. I will also attach a map to this message so that you may fight Frimgear without problems, and unless we receive new orders, we will continue with our mission. Signed, Captain Yarohin, MS Unicorn. Needless to say, the prince immediately ordered his men to gather their belongings and prepare to march, for they had a long journey through the ashlands ahead of them, and as they marched, another messenger bird arrived, this time from Muzaka itself. Apparently, the city council was locked in a discussion regarding some areas in the city that were available to reacquire now that refugees no longer clogged every single street. It was quite a significant part of dockyard slums, at the very bottom of the cliff and close to the harbour, and to one of city gates, and the councillors could not decide on how to use it. One group, mostly composed of old lesser nobility from the continent, as well as some military-minded locals, claimed that it could be used as headquarters for the knights. Sure, there were only a handful of knights in Muzaka right now, and all of them were attached to Arius's force, but in time more would surely follow, or be promoted from amongst the common soldiers. And if they had a compound in the city, they could use it to better organize their ranks, which would no doubt make them far better trained. But another group, led mostly by a local merchants guild, wanted to turn the area into an actual portside district, with warehouses, taverns, cranes and all that infrastructure needed to make a bustling trading port. And while it certainly would not be as prestigious as headquarters of some knightly orders, it would help Muzzakan army indirectly by providing them with additional funds, since trade, after all, can always be taxed. And so, it fell upon the prince to resolve this deadlock, but as one might expect, it was not an easy decision. Still, after a few hours of pondering both ideas and talking to his followers, Arius decided that while a large amount of knights would certainly be useful, actually supplying them with equipment and paying their wages would no doubt be too much for already strained Muzzakan coffers. So when the bird finally carried Lord Governor's answer back to the council, the merchant faction rejoiced, for their proposition was accepted. It was now up to them to get the economy running, and in doing so provided the golden grease, so that all other gears of the machine of this new colonial state could turn without issues. But for Arius and his men, those were distant affairs, for as they entered another part of the Frostlands, straight from the scorching heat of fiery hills, their minds were focused solely on retaking Frimgear and avenging its inhabitants. It was hard to say whether or not the town seceded during the revolution, or whether it was attacked even before that, but one thing was clear: this once was a town that belonged to Kingdom of Southern, and now, by extension, to Muzaka. Those were Arius's people, and they were all killed during Frostling attack, and, in fact, as the army approached the town, the scouts found a mass, almost open grave, filled with remains of thousands of previous inhabitants. It served as yet another sobering thought, especially to those who were raised here and have not remembered Archmage's rebellion that decimated the old continent. Frostlings were a nightmare. For most people, a nightmare that ended over 3 decades ago, when Arius's father stepped over the shattered, frozen corpse of his first wife, who was also his retainer, picked up her sword, and, despite half of his body being almost dead from frostbite, sliced the Archmage in half, ending his insane rebellion on the spot. The war still lasted for almost a decade, but it was no longer a hopeless, suicidal struggle it was at the start. But here, in Muzaka, this conflict continued. The Frostlings were still here and, just like back home, did all they could to rid their snowy paradise of warmbloods. So it comes as no surprise that, when Arius's army reached the outskirts of a town, almost unprotected save for a bunch of hastily raised barricades, they showed no mercy to Frostling warriors. The Cold Ones did their best, but against such overwhelming numbers and such ferocious hate, they couldn't do anything and were butchered to the last within an hour. Frimgear was retaken. Its inhabitants were dead, but Arius knew that people would come here soon regardless of it, if only because the town itself was still intact, and so people could claim many of the buildings for themselves. But it was also a symbolic victory. The island was still far from secured, but the 3 major settlements were back in Muzzakan hands. It was a good start for the exiled prince, far better one than he expected, but then, well, then things only got weirder from there.
Soldiers of Muzaka, you are victorious once again. Great job securing the town. We got some wine back from the continent from merchants from across the ocean, so I'd say it's a good occasion to break those barrels open, but since the sun is still high we have more work to do. Drinking will have to wait until evening. You there, soldier, send word back to the camp that they can start moving into the town. I want a field hospital in one of the intact buildings to deal with our wounded as soon as they're able. Knight Commander, you take your men and get outside of the walls. Check our surroundings for any other settlements. Maybe you'll find some survivors or Frostling patrols we might have missed. Deal with them if you can, but if they're too much, simply mark their position and move on. We'll deal with them later. Lieutenant Stalheim, I want you to take the archers and check the outskirts of the town, and while you're at it you may show them some of your famed elven marksmanship.
Will do, Lord Governor. Also, I don't count on finding any survivors, but we may encounter some of their civilians. What should we do then?
No civilians among the Frostlings, Lieutenant. Our very existence is a threat to them, so I doubt they'll be willing to surrender. So if you find any, put them out of their misery. Now, the rest of you. Captain, I want the militia to secure the center of the town. Mr. Storm, you take your students and our engineers and see about bringing down that frozen spire. It looks sturdy, but between your skills and some gunpowder from our stores, it should go down nicely. And the rest of us? Well, I suppose the rest of us should get to work on fixing all the damage these bastards have done to the town. From what I've seen, we're going to have to demolish dozens of buildings since they're so badly damaged, and rebuild them if we want our people to return here. So everyone without orders, and not wounded, get to it. Miss Pireni, we could use your support as well, since this will be a lot of mundane manual work. You think you could bring some of these Frostlings back up? That way they could at least help to rebuild the town they destroyed.
I can try, but it won't help. It's too cold now that we're so close to their spire, so their corpses are frozen solid. I could reanimate them, but they would not be able to move. If we were talking about any other race, I could just drop their bodies near some campfire or something, but in their case it won't work because they'll just melt.
Right, makes sense I suppose. But skeletons would not melt, right? There was this huge pile of them in that open grave outside of the city, probably previous inhabitants. I'm sure you could get them up and running so they could help us with rebuilding.
That I can do. I'm going to need a few dozen men to help me though, and quite a lot of leather to make harnesses for them.
Harnesses? What do you need them for? I saw you reanimating a bunch of elves during our attack on Sur Carys, and you needed nothing like that back then.
Yes, because they were freshly killed, so they had all their muscles to do the moving. Seriously, my prince, for someone who relies so much on my amazing skills, you seem to know almost nothing about my work.
I suppose it's true. Truth be told, necromancy might have been legalized, but it was never too widespread, at least not back home. So, sorry to say, but I'm still kind of confused by your abilities.
Allow me to explain then. Always good to understand what we love, don't you think? Come on, we can talk on our way to the camp. I'm going to need materials from there after all. So, where to start? I know. First and foremost, you must understand that necromancy is more of a craft than art. Unlike all those fancy spells Sparky throws around, it requires a lot of preparations beforehand, because as much as people like to say that we bring dead back to life, we can't actually resurrect anyone.
Ah yes, I remember one of factory owners back home saying something about it. He said that he had issues convincing his workers to become ghouls.
Only because your law forced him to, but he was basically correct. You can't make ghouls or any other intelligent undead out of corpses. Once they're dead, the spark is gone, and if Starcult is correct, it moves on to another world under a different start to begin again. The body that's left is just a pile of meat and bones, but that's not the point. The thing is that you can only turn living beings into ghouls, with or without their consent, in a special ritual. I won't go into details, but it basically kills their bodies, but at the same time leaves them suspended in that very moment of death. So their flesh and internal organs no longer work, but their minds still do. And then we have the mindless undead, zombies and skeletons, and there is a good reason why bringing them back is not called resurrection but reanimation, because, as I said, they're gone. All I can do is act as a sort of puppeteer, send a spark of energy into their lifeless bodies to move them around. But with skeletons it's a bit more difficult because they're basically just a bunch of loose bones. With no muscles to move them, necromancers have to get creative, which is why we need to build those harnesses. Wrap a skeleton in one and it can move surprisingly well, certainly better than a corpse with more flesh still on it, because they don't have to deal with rigor mortis. Still though, useful as they are, they can't really perform anything too complicated because, in the end, they're all controlled just by me. But with those stones Sparky and his Boy Scouts are making, it became far easier, and I don't feel like I go insane if I have more than just a handful of charges to control.
That actually makes a lot of sense, and explains why most of the undead we saw back home on the continent were ghouls. But there are two things that don't fit. First one is that bartender I saw in your tavern. He was a skeleton, but he clearly was not mindless and he wasn't wearing any harness. And the second thing are ghosts. Those wraiths and phantoms we've seen before. They seem to be able to think just fine, but at the same time they don't have bodies, and by extension brains. So how do they work?
First, Manuel is a special case. I told you that ghouls need to take very special care of themselves because their bodies are wearing out with time. So, simply speaking, Manuel is just a ghoul who forgot to take his formaldehyde bath every week. And he used to be a sorcerer as well, so he knows how to keep his body together with his brain, which, if you're interested, is still apparently within his skull. But as for the ghosts, well, I have to say they're just as surprising to you as they are to me. I actually talked to Sparky about them and had to endure an extremely long, self-absorbed lecture, but in the end he told me that no one back on the continent recorded creatures like them before. I know I can't create anything like them. Maybe, for some reason we can't understand yet, they're just a local thing. Which is exactly why I wanted to explore that abandoned city we've seen before. It's clear that these islands were inhabited by someone long ago, so maybe those people knew things about necromancy that we can't even imagine.
Or our souls don't leave for the stars when we die here, and are instead trapped to wander these islands forever. Oh, don't give me that look, I know you thought the same thing. But I see your point. We'll try to get these ruins secured as soon as we can, and see if they hold any answers. And I actually have an idea how to do it without a bloodbath on our side, though in order to do that I'll have to get back to Muzaka. For now though... Oh, Mr. Storm, back already? The spire is still standing from what I can see. Indeed it does, your highness, but a runner came to me to say that the Unicorn sailed into port, and Captain Yarohin urgently wants to see us. He apparently brought someone with him, but I think the runner might have been drunk off his mind. He said that Yarohin came ashore with a cat. Human-sized cat. And it talks.